In this tutorial, we're going to discuss variable scope in Python. It's a pretty interesting concept that everyone should actually know pretty well. It basically helps you understand more about how variables work, how they're created, how they're destroyed, and a little bit about how they're accessed as well. It also helps you avoid running into certain errors while programming, all right? So it's a pretty useful concept to actually know. So what is the variable scope? Well, basically, when you create a variable, when you declare a variable anywhere in your Python program, whether it be within your main program right here, okay, or whether it be within a function, whether it be within a class, or whether it be within a code block like the while loop or the for loop or init statement even. So basically, whenever you create a variable like this, it has a sort of a scope. It has a lifetime or an area in which it can be accessed. And once it goes out of that area, it's destroyed. Okay, it only exists within that area or within that scope. Okay, so basically that's what this is about. We're going to be teaching you about the scope that variables exist in, okay, and basically about nested scopes and all that kind of stuff. Don't worry, I'll explain all this as we proceed. All right. So how do you normally declare a variable in Python? You do something like this, right? Name is equal to, okay, where name is a variable, and something like coder, okay? And now you want to access this. How are you going to do that? So you just do print name, okay, and run this, and there you go. You have that printed out here. You just accessed the variable of name coder. So basically this area over here, this region, okay, it's called the global scope. Basically everything declared in this region, every variable declared in this region can be accessed anywhere in the Python program. Alright, so now let's actually create a new scope. Okay, now basically the rules are that if you create a scope within a scope, the nested scope can access any variable in the parent scope. So basically when I create this function over here called func, it can access any variable that we declared in the global scope. Okay, now let's call the function. Okay, now this should work because function, the local scope, okay, the local scope within function can access anything within the global scope, okay, which is its parent scope. Now let's run this. Okay, and there you go, correct output. Now let's basically take a look at something else. Let's create a new variable in here called value and give it the value 5. Okay, now what I want to do is basically try to access this. So basically what I'm trying to do is making the global scope access this variable called value in the local scope of the function. Now is this going to work? Let's try it out. Nope, it did not work. It says value is not defined. Why is that? Well, the reason is that value is in a different scope. It's in a local scope, okay? It's in a child scope, and the parent scope cannot access the child scope. The child scope can access the parent scope, but not the other way around. Okay, remember that. Now, the reason for this actually is that when this code runs over here, okay, when function is run, basically this value variable is created, okay, and it only exists while it's still within the local scope. This is a bit hard to understand because there's concepts like garbage collection and stuff, but basically what happens is that once this function ends, okay, once this function's code block ends, the variable value is actually destroyed. This is basically the concept of garbage collection, alright, a very basic version. Basically, once this function is over, okay, once it's not being called anymore, okay, it's destroyed. The variable value is destroyed. That's why you can access it within the scope. Okay, let's remove that from here and try this. There you go, it worked. The reason you can access it here is because it still exists within the scope, okay, by the time this statement is called. But once we go out of it, okay, like once we come over here, okay, like imagine that this line was executed, okay, this line was executed, value still exists, this line was executed, and because value still exists, it was able to get printed. But once it reaches over here, basically this line over here, basically the value variable is destroyed. Okay, it's gone, and we can no longer access it. And that's why trying to access it will give us a not defined error, because a variable of that name doesn't exist. Okay, now let's try doing something new. Okay, let's stop working with the global scope, and let's just focus on local scopes. Okay, a local scope within a local scope. Now let's create a new variable called inner function. Okay, and here I hope I'll be able to better demonstrate what's going on. Now let's create a new variable called just value2. Okay, and let's give it the value 10. Now what I'm going to do here basically is try to access value. Okay, and let's just call this function over here. Now what are we doing here? Basically we have a scope over here, okay, which belongs to function, okay, func, and then we have another scope in here, okay, a nested scope called inner func. Okay, now basically what I'm trying to do here with this print value statement is access the value variable here in the parent. Now as I mentioned before, this will work. Okay, child can access the parent, but parent cannot access the child. So let's try this, and there you go, 5 was printed out. Now let's try this the other way around. Okay, let's try to access value 2 from the parent class, the parent scope, sorry. And there you go, same problem, value 2 is not defined. That's because once value 2 exited this function, okay, it was destroyed. That's why it does not exist. Okay, now let's just get rid of this, okay, and we'll now go back to a more basic concept. Okay, now what am I doing here? I just created two variables called value. Now let's say I try to print this out over here. What's going to happen? Okay, 10 was printed out. So basically this value variable was printed out, okay, not this one, of course, because for all intents and purposes, to this print statement, this value variable does not even exist. That is because it is destroyed by the time the print statement executes, right? Now let's try this over here. Now this is interesting. Okay, what's going to happen here? If I were to remove this, we would get func. We would get 10 printed out, okay, because value is this variable over here. But what if I declare a variable of the same name here in this local scope? Let's try it out. Okay, look at that, 5 was printed out. So what really happened here? Well, the thing is, the way the program works is that it first checks the local scope. So basically when this print statement was executed, okay, and it saw this variable name, it says, okay, I need to print out value. Then it's going to begin looking for a variable called value. Okay, now the first thing it's going to do is check the local scope. If it finds a variable called value in the local scope, then it'll print it out, okay, and it'll stop right there, which is why 5 was printed out. However, if it does not find that variable in the local scope, and then it will go to the global scope. Okay, this concept actually works in classes as well, okay, if you're interested. So basically, yeah, because this variable wasn't here, in the previous example, this variable was printed out, okay, because the value, the variable value didn't exist in the local scope, so it went to the global scope instead, where it did find a variable called value. But if we declare it in here, it'll just print this out without actually going to this one. All right. Now on that same note, let's try something a bit different. Okay. In Python we have a keyword called global. Okay, like this, global. Now what global does, it's sort of used to basically avoid any problems. Like maybe, for instance, when you wrote value is equal to 5, you actually meant to change this variable over here. Like what if you didn't mean to create a new variable, right? So this can actually cause problems. So what you do is basically declare this as global. Okay, this tells the program that I'm not creating a new variable. Okay, I'm not creating a new variable in the local scope. What I'm doing is that I'm creating I'm not creating anything, I'm just modifying the global variable, okay, the global variable value over here. So basically let's just do it like this. Okay, let me just demonstrate this real quick. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is basically print out the value. Okay, Now, what's going to happen? Okay, hold on. Slight mistake there. You need to actually first declare it as global, okay, and then change it like that. Okay. Now let's try this. Okay, now look at that. 5 was printed out. Now, how did this happen? Because the value was 10 over here, right? So how did it become 5? Well, that's pretty simple. You see, what we did over here was used global, right? So basically, what we did here was modify this variable over here. We didn't create a new one and assign it a value 5. We basically modified the global variable. Okay? So that's basically the concept of variable scope. Okay, and of course you can see this in other places as well. Okay, and in classes and stuff. Okay, and especially in other languages, because in other languages there's actually the curly brackets. Okay, that are used to actually represent code blocks. In Python, basically the code blocks are, or maybe basically the local scope. Okay, local scope or code block, same thing. They're basically represented with indentation. Okay, so basically indentation over here defines a new scope, okay, a new code block. All right, so I think that's about it. I think you should be clear as to what variable scope is, and you should also be aware of, any problems that can occur. Okay, you don't want to end up actually creating 2 different variables. Okay, one in the global, one in the local. Okay, you should know when to use the global keyword. Okay, you use it, of course, when you mean to be accessing the same variable that was in the global scope. Okay, so don't get confused. It's actually pretty simple. Just practice it and you'll understand it better. Okay, so that's it for now. If you want to see more content like this in the future, make sure to subscribe, and see you in a later video.